Hi everyone, Stjepan here. In today's middle game video, I'm going to talk about a very important topic, and that's prophylaxis, or preventing what your opponent is trying to do. And very often, weaker players, such as myself, tend to concentrate on their own plans, on their own ideas, on their own tactical moves or checkmating patterns or whatever, and very often they neglect what their opponent is trying to do. And chess is really about dividing your thinking time in between what you plan to do yourself and trying to think of ways to prevent what your opponent is trying to do. So today we are going to look at some examples of prophylaxis, and hopefully this video will help you concentrate more on spotting and preventing your opponent's plans. In chess there are two types of plans, positive plans and negative plans. Positive plans are all the plans which you are trying to achieve yourself, and negative plans are plans with which you try to restrict or prevent your opponent from doing something, and that's in one word called prophylaxis. Prophylactic thinking is something that some players were famous for, such as Tigran Petrosyan. But every single strong player, including the ones we consider to be tactical geniuses or aggressive types who really neglected defense, even those like Mihail Tal or Alexander Alyokin or others, had their prophylactic thinking on a very high level. So it's very important to prevent your opponent's threats while pushing through your own. So let's look at some examples. To start with, I'm going to show you some examples in the opening and one example in the endgame, just to give you an idea that prophylaxis is a very broad term. So let's look at the Roy Lopez. e4, e5, knight f3, knight 6, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4. This is just the normal closed Roy Lopez. I'm not going to go into these moves too much. Bishop to b3. And in this position, the most common move for black is d6. Now d6 defends the e5 pawn. That means that the c6 knight is free to move. It doesn't have to keep the defense of the e5 pawn, which means that the knight from c6 is now ready to jump into a5, harass the bishop and win the bishop pair. Hence, white plays the prophylactic move c3. Now, most people who are not experienced in chess think that the move is simply about preventing the knight from coming into b4 and d4, and for white to push through with d4, but the main idea behind the move c3 is when knight a5 is played, the bishop can go to c2, and of course that's why black doesn't play knight to a5. So this is one prophylactic move. After black castles, white plays another prophylactic move. Now there is a variation with white playing d4, but this move allows bishop to g4. And that's why after castles for black, by far the most common move with over 23,000 games is pawn to h3. And this is a prophylactic move for two reasons. One of them is it stops bishop g4 clearly, and the other one, it gives white luft, which is long-term prophylaxis. You are preparing for a situation in which your opponent is going to have rooks coming down the board and in some positions threatening checkmate. So c3 and h3, two prophylactic moves in a row in the Roy Lopez with white pieces for white. And obviously, you might consider them too slow or something, but c3 and h3, as theory has already proved a million times, are very useful moves. Another example of prophylaxis, let me just clear the board. e4, c5, knight f3, d6, pawn to d4, takes, knight to f6, knight to c3, is the knight of Sicilian, pawn to a6. Pawn to a6 is a prophylactic move with one purpose, stopping three of white's pieces from entering b5. A very useful prophylactic move. Now, you might argue that black has many more useful moves, knight c6, bishop d7, e6, e5, g6. Yes, there are tons of moves, but the Najdorf is a very playable variation, so a prophylactic move leads to one of the most famous variations of the Sicilian. In an endgame, if we look at this example, which is just a random position I set up on the board, white is a pawn up, black has 4 pawns, white has 5 pawns. And now, with white to move, you obviously have one plan, and that's I want to win the game, create a passed pawn, and that should be it. So we have an extra pawn. So any pawn exchanges basically lead to a draw, or may mean that a draw is more likely, so you don't want to exchange the pawns, because if you are left with one pawn and the knight versus the knight, it's fairly obvious that black can draw that. So continue your prophylactic thinking. What can you do to prevent your opponent's plans. Now, the first thing you need to ask yourself during a game are, what does my opponent plan to do? That's prophylactic thinking. Don't just think, how do I win the game? I shouldn't trade pawns because it's a draw. How do I win? I don't know, I'll just move my king around. If you can't find a positive plan, then probably there is a very strong negative plan you can employ. And prophylactic thinking is often found only when we don't have a clear plan. But the point of this video should be that you should think about prophylactic moves even if you have active moves, because very often restraining your opponent is going to be much more important than playing an active plan yourself. Now, I'm not claiming that this move is the best move in this position. I've only analyzed it briefly. White could probably move around with the king or do something else. But a very clear example of prophylaxis here would be the move f3. Why the move f3? Well, this knight on f6 has how many squares? One square on e4, the other square on g4. It doesn't have h5 and g3, obviously, because both pawns are defending the square. It could move around the board, but towards what end? I mean, there's basically no other entry point. Once you play the move f3, this knight has no moves. And, I mean, the knight is completely restricted. If g5, well, you have to decide whether you want to push this or not, but I would probably play the move knight to f2. So when the exchange happens, you're still controlling these squares with the king and with the knight, and you have a passed pawn. So pawn to f3 is a clear example of prophylaxis, and this is what you have to think about during the game. If you can, try to restrain your opponent's pieces as much as possible. If your opponent's pieces don't have room to maneuver, if you crush them with prophylactic moves, then your position is going to be better. Obviously, after f3, the white knight has many more ideas. The white knight can move around the board, hop into some active squares, etc. But as I said, this is just a random position, just to show you that negative plans are often very useful even in the endgame, especially in the middle game. Now we are going to look at 3 middle game positions. One of them is easy, one of them is hard, one of them is medium, so I chose them accordingly. Let's go over the easy position first. Okay, so in this position, and by the way, I have to say that I had a chess lesson with my coach today, and when I came to the lesson, we did prophylaxis, which I was planning to do for the video, so that was a nice coincidence. And this position we actually had on the board in our lesson, so I'm using it here. In this position, the first thing you have to ask yourself if you want to find a prophylactic move is, what does my opponent want to do? When we look at this position, it's clear that the pieces are sort of equal. Both bishops are equal, rooks are equal. Kings are not equal. The black king is better than the white king because it's one square closer to the center. And yeah, what does white want to do? If he doesn't really want to improve his rook, the rook is spinning the bishop along the c-file, so it's okay. The bishop is defending d4, d5, it's defending the weak a2 pawn, so the bishop is okay as well. What else can white do? He can push the pawn, but I mean it's not too active. So this probably isn't a plan for white. So I would say that the most probable plan for white is to move his king and march up the board to the defense. Now the bishop is restricting the g1 square. So what would be a great prophylactic move in this position for black? It's black to play, and black plays the move h3. After h3, this king is never getting into the game, so you manage to kill off the only plan white had. This is prophylactic thinking at its finest. After the move h3, white can resign. The game is just over. Black is going to play king f6, king e5. If the rook moves, then king d4. If the rook doesn't move, then king takes, probably. And black will have a king, white will not have a king, the game is lost. And there's no question about it. The move h3 is such a strong prophylactic move that white can basically resign. If black plays something stupid, let's say rook to a8, then white can play either h3 or king to g2, and it's a whole different story. I mean, probably just h3 himself and... Yeah, okay, sorry. Just h3 himself, and now it's not that clear that black is winning. So Remember prophylactic moves and restraining your opponent. So in this position, black has only one good move to win the game. After h3, white doesn't have a plan. White is playing a king down. So this is a prophylactic move which completely kills off the position. Now, if you are in this position with the black pieces and you are only considering your own plans, let's say you think, I want to win the d5 pawn. I'm going to march my king up the board. King f6, h3, and it's not that clear anymore. It's not that clear. King here, rook here. Okay, so now white actually has a king. White can enter the game. So it's not that clear. The second example I wanted to show you, and we are going to flip the board for this one, is what usually happens when players make a mistake in their calculation and in their prophylactic thinking. So, okay, in this position, black castled, white continued with the move g6. Okay, and now black is thinking, after the move g6, what is white's plan? What is white threatening? The threat is fairly clear here. Queen takes pawn, queen h7 checkmate, and that's it. That's the plan. There's nothing better, and obviously white is threatening to checkmate. So now you have to think, okay, what can you do? You can allow white to take and move the rook to e8, and then after queen h7 you can play king to f8 and you can escape here, but not really because the knight is restricting this. So rook to e8 isn't a possibility. Okay, what else can you do? In the game, a losing move was played, and I'm going to show you the correct move first. So what you want to do is prevent checkmate. You can either prevent checkmate by making room for your king, so that would be prophylaxis, rook to e8, bad prophylaxis, but prophylaxis, because after rook e8, queen takes, king f8, checkmate, so that's not prophylaxis, it just loses the game. Another way to defend would be to defend the pawn on h4 simply. And the best move would be to remove this attacking piece. So if you can manage to remove this pawn, then queen takes h4, queen h7 isn't checkmate. It's not even a possible move because black can just take the queen. So the correct move is bishop to e8. After queen takes h4, bishop to h6, bishop to g6, bishop takes g6. White is still better, but he is not checkmating. After g6, however, black found another prophylactic move, but it unfortunately loses to a beautiful tactic. Black played the very obvious f5. f5 simply defends the pawn, and the queen can't take the pawn, which means that the queen can't go to h7 and checkmate. However, white found a marvelous tactic. White played the unbelievable rook to b8. After rook to b8, the game is just over. It seems like a very silly rook sacrifice, but if you take the rook, then queen takes. And what do? There's nothing you can do. It's just checkmate. So a very nice move, and I mean, it's just over. The game is over. So after g5, perhaps black should have thought about a prophylactic move before castling. Castles g6, and it was already very hard. Bishop to e8 was the only move. So let's see what black could have done after g5. And after such an attack happens, prophylaxis is really hard to do because obviously white has a huge advantage. And castling seemed probably like the best move because now he is threatened with simply queen takes here. Okay. After castles. So let's see what the engine thinks. The engine thinks that castling is the best move and white is winning anyway. But let's see. Let's see if black could have done anything else. White is threatening queen to f7 check, which is clear enough, checkmate. So this can't be taken because of takes here. So that's not a move. What else? I'm not sure. I can't really suggest a move. I think castling is the best move. So prophylaxis perhaps should have been done even sooner. Rook a7 was played here by black. Let's see if he could have done something better instead of rook a7. After queen to f2, was there any prophylaxis here? So the next moves by black were rook to a7, and then white played g5, and we agreed that the game is just lost. So after queen to f2, is there a better defense? If we know what white's threat is now. And it's really hard to anticipate all of the threats, but after you see it, a great way to practice prophylaxis is to try and rewind the position, find the prophylactic move, and then improve on your play. So what can we do here? Castles, perhaps immediately. Queen takes here. Let's see if castles, queen takes. Yeah, this looks just too dangerous. Queen f2. What else? Oh, but rook to a7 was... Oh, rook to a7 was defending the f7 threat, so let's go back. Rook f7, g5. So yeah, this actually wasn't checkmate. I made a mistake. I'm sorry, so let's come back to this move. Takes, takes, takes. So this isn't possible because of the rook on a7, I'm sorry. I had a lot of positions without the rook on a7 because I came back one more move and I misplayed this. So let's see what can black do here. Okay, so let's go back to this defense. Rook to a7, g5. We're looking at knight takes g5, bishop takes g5, pawn takes g5. Let's see what the engine thinks. Ah, there, yeah, okay, there's this check. He can sacrifice a piece. Takes, takes, and then I guess here. Yeah. Okay, so this doesn't work either. So can we find a better move after g5? So basically this is prophylaxis, this is what you have to do. At every stage of the game you need to ask yourself, what's my opponent planning to do? And when it's really tactical and you are under attack like here, then it's going to be really hard and you're going to have a rough time. But after g6, you should really be able to find the best moves and at least try to think prophylactically, because you are forced to think prophylactically here. Basically, when you're threatened with a mate in 2, then you have to force yourself to think. Now we are going to look at the third example where the situation isn't so obvious and you are not forced to defend, which makes it harder to spot the threat, hence makes it harder to think prophylactically. In this position, if we compare the pieces, this rook is definitely worse than this rook. You could say that these two rooks are almost equal, but I think that this one is better because it's helping white with his break e5, which is white's main idea. This bishop is a monster piece, almost as good as the knight, but the bishop is controlling more squares and serving a great purpose. So black wants to do the following. Black wants to get his rook out. Moving the king from the ideal square wouldn't be a good idea, so probably black wants to play rook g8, rook g7 and involve the rook into the game. So that's what I would think about doing if I was black. But first let's consider white's threats. What's white threatening to do? White's main idea is the move e5, so definitely white wants to push e5 through. If white manages to get e5 when it's defended enough, then this pawn is moving forward and it's going to be a lot of trouble for black. So white probably wants to play the move f4. If white plays f4, let's just say black does nothing. f4, nothing, e5, takes, takes. This position is almost over. This is just, these two pawns are too strong and black is just going to lose the game. The bishop is now much, much better than the knight. Once this rook moves, then firstly this pawn is falling, secondly everything is falling apart and black is just going to lose the game. So after the move rook to e3, which was last played, black has to understand what white's plan is. And this is the hardest one I decided to put as an example, because preventing a subtle move, fairly subtle move such as e5 is much harder than stopping checkmate, like here after g6, because you're threatening with the mate in 2. So how do we stop e5? Or better, e5 is going to be possible if black plays the move, if white plays the move f4. So the only logical move is g5. That's prophylaxis. You are stopping the move f4. So g5 is the correct move. But now we come to the question, what happens after the thematic pawn chain movement g3? After g3, white is once again threatening f4, and after, let's say, black does nothing, so f4 takes, takes. Once again, white is now threatening e5, and it's impossible to stop. So let's go back. After the move g5, g3 is played, but now you have a double purpose prophylactic move. Remember what we wanted to do with the rook g8, rook g7, moving the rook outside. Now the move rook g8 once again prevents f4, because after f4 takes, the pawn is pinned and black is winning the game. So this position is, I thought, very instructive and very thematic for prophylaxis, because these types of moves are usually missed. If we go back to the first positions, a6 in the Najdorf you are going to find because you know the theory. In any endgame position, it's going to be much simpler to restrain a piece when it's only one piece on the board. In positions like these, you are threatened with checkmate, so you are forced to react. You can see the checkmate coming, and it's in positions like these, before h3. You also have basically one piece to restrain from coming into the game, so it's also fairly easy to find the move h3. But the last example, you are stopping a destruction of your center with the move e5. So g5 is an easy move to find, but many people would give up on the move after they see the move g3. And combining the plans with rook to g8 is a marvelous idea. And now, even though the white king can move, it's not really that clear. It's an unclear position, and many things can happen. Okay, these are the three examples I wanted to show you. There are tons more, and if you analyze any chess game, I would advise you to do one thing. Ask yourself which moves are positive plans and which moves are prophylactic. That's actually a good exercise to spot how the great players are thinking prophylactically. Take any game, it could be absolutely any game. I actually found this position today while analyzing some games. This is Botvinnik Keres 1966. I randomly analyzed some games and I found this. This is the English. I'm trying to prepare something against the English, so anyway. So you can take any game and find great prophylactic ideas. So obviously in this case, his move f5 wasn't really a good prophylactic idea because of the nice tactic, but yeah, take any game and try to split the moves into positive and negative moves and try to spot how great players are playing prophylactic moves. I hope this will help. I hope your exercises will help you improve, and definitely you should be able to spot more negative plans during your game. Remember that it's just as important to prevent your opponent as it is to push forward your own plans, sometimes much more important. In the last example we saw, it was vital to play the move g5 here. If you don't prevent your opponent's plan, even though there's no good plan for black here, okay, there's a plan of rook g8, rook g7, and I mean, you're going to lose the game. So in this game, obviously rook to g8, rook to g7 was a good plan because the rook is a dead piece, but it's the losing plan if you miss what your opponent is trying to do. So always, on every move, consider what your opponent is trying to do, and if you have to prevent it, prevent it. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you like this video on prophylaxis. Please let me know what you think. Please link some great examples of prophylactic moves if you want. I would like to get a discussion going in the comments and find some great examples such as this one with after g6 this tactic, and try to find some defensive or attacking prophylaxis. And thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.